So let's just do that. So it's done. All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for giving up what for some of you might be a long weekend. For those of you lucky enough to have today off or to take today off, some of you are working, then that's what happens when we get older. We have to work on days like today. So welcome all. Amy had a question about Kath not having access yet. I think she's got her class list now and she should get access shortly, but for the moment we'll just carry on, and I welcome anyone to this session who's not part of my groups. And what happens hereafter, to those of you who aren't part of my groups, I can find out and see how you proceed, but she should get access in the next 24 hours. I think there was a problem. I know one of my groups was quite big, so they might move a couple of students across to Kath, but we'll sort all of that out in the wash. But for the moment, you're all here, and I just want to welcome you to the second semester of Psych. It's an interesting semester. We've got lots of interesting topics, and we actually get into abnormal psychology, which is great, and treating abnormal psychology. So again, diverse topics, but interesting topics, and I hope you enjoy. I hope you all have got access to your module outline, which we will follow. We don't follow all the chapters in the textbook, so make sure that you do pay attention to your module outline, because we jump initially to chapter 11, so we do skip out 1 or 2 chapters. So just make sure that you've got access. So this first module is on human development, and please, if anyone's got any questions, please just raise them in the chat or pop up your hand and I can answer them for you, and we will see how we go. It's a little long, this section, but if we don't sort of finish it by about 7 or we're far off, then I will record the second part as a separate recording and I'll upload it. So let's see how far we get. But hopefully we can make it through all the important points of the chapter. So I hope you're all with me. Learning Unit 1 for this semester is on human development, and it's chapter 11 in your textbook. So this speaks about human development really from conception right the way through to adulthood and aging, and they call it womb to tomb. So right from conception, which is important, up until old age, and eventually people pass on. So as per your module outline, these are the different themes that we cover, and you'll see in your module outline there's some specific page references for you to refer to. I hope you've had some time this semester to start working through this chapter. We cover really the prenatal stage, which is from conception through to early childhood and the different developments that take place in that time of children's lives, moving into adolescence and into adulthood. And a lot of the chapter does focus around the early childhood section, because that is probably one of the most important aspects for growth in developing children to their full potential. So that's how the module outline works, and we cover what is outlined in that module outline. So I hope you're all with me, and let's begin our journey on what it means for what is developmental psychology or human development. So right from conception through to death, it's a lifelong journey. Psychology used to very much focus on early childhood, young children, birth to about 5 or 6 or 7 years old, but gradually the discipline has expanded to take into account that development continues to take place right the way through our aging process. So when we talk about development, we look at it in different sections. We look firstly at physical development, which is especially relevant in children, which looks at their motor skills development and various psychophysiological processes. Cognitive development, especially as well, is around language, problem solving, conceptual understanding, even morality, and social emotional development. So how does our personality develop? How do we develop identities? And how do we develop our self-concept and how we think about ourselves? So when we look at developmental psychology, we don't just look at it around thinking. We have to take into account physical changes, cognitive changes, as well as social and emotional changes that take place over our lifespan. So developmental psychology, it looks at the way that change occurs during our lifespan. Dominant models are very much around stage theories, that we progress through various stages, and once that stage is complete, we move on to the next stage. So it's a developmental period during which patterns of behavior are exhibited and certain capacities become established, and they need to be progressed through in order, and one stage builds on the next. So that's a type of process by which change occurs. It occurs very sequentially, and each stage builds on the next. But what actually causes the change, it's very much an interaction between our biological processes as well as the environment. So it's really important to consider that although development in many theories is seen as stage-like, there is a very much an interactionist process between our environment and the biology of our body. So one of the ways that we can see that, and an example that we can give, is that if we picture children who are living in poverty, they have impacts in their lives, things like hunger, illness, poor caregiver patterns, insecurity, instabilities. So as a result of that, as a result of their environment, their developmental processes are often compromised. And I mean, that can lead to physical impairments, it can lead to academic impairments, it can lead to behavioral impairments and problems, and even social and emotional difficulties. So that is why, or how you can see that the environment in which children are raised and the environment in which we are brought up in as adolescents and even as adults has an impact on our developmental psychology. So the human life cycle really goes from when fertilization takes place right through to death. And at every stage, although we're developing physically and cognitively and emotionally, what's happening in the world around us and the conditions in which we are living impact on that process. So you'll see throughout the textbook, there's a very nice case study of quite a typical South African family living in difficult times and how circumstances interact on their developmental processes in various ways across the life cycle. So just read through that case study at the beginning of the chapter, and then you will see it referred to throughout the chapter where it's actually applied. So it's a very nice approach to this particular module, is to see how that case study interacts with development psychology. So let's start right at the beginning, which is prenatally. And prenatal means conception to birth. Okay, that is our prenatal stage, and it's a key area of development. And so the three stages that exist in that prenatal development is the very short stage of the germinal phase, which is really from where conception takes place to where that little embryo is planted on the uterine wall, very short stage of 2 weeks. And then you have the embryonic stage, and that is after it's implanted on the uterine wall, then basically the organs of the body start to form, and it's also a time of vulnerability. A lot of miscarriages take place in those first 12 weeks, so it's when the embryo itself is very vulnerable to things, especially external influences. And then the fetal development, which is the longest phase of this prenatal phase, and it's about 7 to 9 weeks up until birth. Okay, so it's about 7 months, and that's where the baby or the embryo really starts to develop. And by the time the pregnant mother gets to about 24 weeks, then the pregnancy is likely to be viable. Prior to that, if somebody experiences difficulties and has to go into early labor. If it's before 24 weeks, then the fetus will not really be able to survive on its own. So those are the different stages of prenatal development. So in your module outline, it says to you, discuss the stages, and those are the 3 stages that take place once that conception has happened, or from the time conception happens. And it's a very big focus now, especially in development and child development, as they speak about the first 1,000 days being absolutely critical to the child's development in later life. So that is from conception to about 2 years old is that first 1,000 days. And it's where a lot of attention is placed in ensuring that children have the optimal start to life. So that obviously very much for that first prenatal period is very much dependent on the well-being of the mother while she's carrying the child. And so influences in that prenatal development stage are very important, especially around the mother's behavior and how it can impact on that unborn child. So part of this module outline tells you to really look at the things that can happen in that prenatal stage that can influence the development. So firstly, we talk about genetic disorders. So sometimes in children, regardless of what the mother does, there can be a genetic disorder that carries through into the child. Sometimes that happens with older parents. There can be a risk of certain genetic problems. So you have abnormalities in the genes, which could be faulty genes with the mother and the father, and that could lead to something like spina bifida. Or you could have abnormalities in the chromosomes. That often happens with older parents, and that's where things like physical disabilities such as Down syndrome come into play. So regardless of what the mother does, there can be a genetic type of disorder that can affect the unborn child. But on top of that, there are maternal influences that can be changed to ensure that child develops optimally. So nutrition is really important. The diet of the mother is important, the nutrients that the mother takes in for optimal growth, as well as the number of calories being sufficient for that baby to grow. So that's why it's really important the mother has a healthy diet and consumes the right vitamins and sufficient vitamins in order for the baby to thrive. If a mother is stressed, there have been shown to be correlations between high levels of stress hormones in the mother, into the fetal bloodstream. And if the mother is anxious and has high levels of those stress hormones or anxiety, the impact of that on children can be hyperactive children, irritable children, children with low birth weights and weight problems, problems feeding or sleeping. They could have a depressed immune system, even have slow motor development. So maternal stress is something that really has to be managed because it has been shown to have a direct impact on a developing child. So that can, to an extent, be controlled by the mother, but at the same time, when you consider the environment that a lot of mothers are existing in, there are going to be stresses in their lives. It's sometimes not easy to control stress, or certainly not easy for a lot of people, especially who live in low socioeconomic circumstances. Maternal illness and psychopathology. So sometimes the mother is exposed to diseases or might carry a disease that has an impact on that unborn child. Something we're very aware of is HIV/AIDS, and the mother transmitting HIV/AIDS or AIDS to her unborn child, as well as the mother being exposed to various infectious diseases such as chickenpox and things like that. So what illnesses the mother experiences can be transmitted or have an impact on that unborn child. So that's important to note. And drug use, maternal drug use, and this even applies to over-the-counter medication. So drug use can be things like alcohol. If a mother drinks during her pregnancy, the impact on the unborn child, and eventually when the child is born, the child can have mental and physical deficiencies and can even be born with what is fetal alcohol syndrome, where you can see in the child. They might be of small stature, they might have various abnormalities, they could be hyperactive, intellectual disabilities. So alcohol during pregnancy can impact on unborn child. Smoking during pregnancy can lead to low birth weights, long-term consequences, especially in cognition, how the children develop cognitively, ADHD, and antisocial behavior. So these are all things that can be prevented by taking care of the maternal well-being of the mother. Other drug uses, marijuana and cocaine, children can be born, and if the mother is a drug user or habitual drug user, they can actually be born with a dependency on those drugs and even go through withdrawal during those first few weeks of their lives. So very much important that the mother is not engaging in any kind of these drugs. Even over-the-counter medicine like aspirin, I've put some of them on the right-hand side there. So aspirin can lead to heart defects, intellectual disabilities, and slow growth. So maternal drug use, it's important to manage that. As well as influence of culture and family. So traditionally, the role of the ancestors, especially when there's a pregnant mother or who miscarries, sometimes the ancestors are believed, especially culturally, to have a hand in that, in terms of turning their back on the child for whatever reason. Children born into poverty, children of single parents, and obviously children where there's maternal depression, people born into low socioeconomic circumstances. So very much our environmental and our social and our cultural issues have an important role in those prenatal phases. Environmental toxins, people exposed to air pollution, radioactivity, even pesticides can have an impact on unborn children. So that's why that stage is so important in child development, and how it's important for mothers to be in control of the environments in which they live. And where they can't be in control, as people working with pregnant mothers, we have to be very much aware of how we can support mothers over that time. It is okay. You always, with any medication, you always read the side effects, and it's obviously going to, if there's a dependency on some kind of painkillers or something, it's going to impact on the child. Once in a while, a Panado or whatever, it should be fine, but I would always ask a medical practitioner's opinion on what is safe to use at that stage. But I think it is being aware of the fact that over-the-counter medicine can have an impact on the child. So now, once a child is born, and we enter this early infancy period of time, from sort of birth right through until sort of early childhood, later childhood, the child develops, and they're rapid. These changes during early childhood is rapid. It's the most important time in a child's developmental stages, is these early childhoods, where most of the brain develops, where they start to get control of their bodies and their motor skills. It's where they start to learn communication. It's where they start to learn thinking and to think cognitively. It's about their social and emotional development. So that's why these stages are very critical, and it's why the focus on early childhood development and care and education is so important, because these years are crucial in a child's life. So from the minute a child is born, a child is born with various reflexes, which are innate in the child, as you know, that little Babinski reflex where they grasp something. If you put your finger in their little hand, their fingers wrap around yours. They start to, they see, but gradually they start to focus, their vision becomes better. They also hear. From the minute they're born, children can hear. They can even hear in the womb. So there are certain things that the child is born with, but there's a natural progression of how development takes place. So we first look at motor development. And so motor development is gross motor, which is the movement of their bodies and their limbs and their big muscles. And then you have your little fine motor development, which is like your fingers, being able to pinch your fingers together and working with your hands. So there's a progression of how this motor development takes place, and being able to move and the physical skills required. And obviously when a baby is born, their very early mobility is hampered by their proportions. So their head is very much bigger than their bodies until their body starts to catch up and they get more in proportion, and that's where they start to develop this motor development. And we see it through crawling up into a point where they can sort of stand up holding onto something, and then they can walk. So it's very much a genetic blueprint as to the progression of development. And there's a pattern of developmental norms that a child generally follows within a certain range. I think a lot of people now panic if their child's not walking by a certain age, that they haven't met a milestone. But there is space either side of that for the child still to develop. So we'll look at the developmental milestones shortly. But the child will gradually, through biology, it will start to learn to crawl and to walk. It starts to respond to experiences. The nervous system develops, and new skills develop quite rapidly with little practice. And again, cultural variations impact on child's physical development. If parents encourage exploration and to go and explore, obviously the child might develop more physically more quickly than children who are swaddled up and kept secure and are not given that freedom to move those limbs. But there's a lot of cultures that wrap up babies and swaddle them tight so they don't quite get those motor skills developed. Yes, you do have access to the slides. I have loaded one group, not the other group, but I'll put the slides up for you, Lorato. That's fine. So the fact that children generally contain control over the upper part of their bodies before their lower part, so they push their hands up, lift their head up when they're crawling, and the fact that they develop more control over their torso before they do their arms and legs are the basic principles by which motor development happens. So it is a process of maturation. It is a gradual unfolding according to a genetic blueprint, as well as the infant's ongoing exploration of the world. And the minute they learn to sort of stand up and walk, then their view of the world changes and they start to experience more things, and that's where cognitively the development starts to happen very quickly. Communication with children right from early after they're born, talking to the child, singing to the child. It's all of those sort of experiences that help to develop all of these areas of the child, from physical to communication to cognition. So if we look at a blueprint of child development, that's sort of how child development typically develops over the first sort of 2 years, 2 to 3 years, even up to 6 in the right-hand table of a child's life, that they can crawl, they can walk, they can kick a ball, they can climb steps, they can hop on one foot, skips, walks from heel to toe, or can balance. So there are developmental milestones where gross motor, fine motor. Cindy, do you have a question? Do you want to ask it? Are you good? If you don't, you can ask it, you're welcome, or otherwise just pop it in the chat. So those are the development milestones that happens generally within those time frames, and that's when the child is at a preschool or something, that these developmental milestones are measured and watched, and that's how children achieve their milestones. Temperament, the textbook briefly mentions temperament, and a temperament is basically, it's a child is born with a certain temperament. You might hear people say, oh, I had an easy child. She slept well and smiled and gurgled, but you also get children who are born with difficult temperaments, or children that are also slow to warm up, or even children that are engaged with all 3 different kinds of temperaments. And generally a child's temperament is stable over time. An easy child might stay an easy child right through, or a difficult child might stay a difficult child right through. And there's also genetic influence in temperament. And we'll see in some of the psychological disorders and abnormalities, sometimes some of those disorders actually stem from the temperament of a child. If the child has been incredibly difficult and fussy and things like that, that child may, it may generate into some kind of psychological disorder later on in life. But you'll see those links as we work through. So just be aware of a temperament and how a child is born with certain emotional reactivity levels. So we've looked at physical development in children and how it takes place, but obviously another important part of development with children is attachment. And that attachment is the bond that links the caregiver or the primary caregiver, which generally is the mother, to the child. Okay, and it happens very early on. Is that attachment between mother and child. 6 to 8 months is where we really start to see the attachment kicking in, and it's where you can see something like separation anxiety. If the child is taken away from the mother for whatever reason, there can be emotional distress. So the child's already formed an attachment with that primary caregiver. If you take the caregiver out of the situation, the child can become distressed, which means that that attachment has formed. So Bowlby had a theory of attachment. He's a theorist, and he basically said attachment is an evolutionary mechanism or a biological mechanism for survival of the vulnerable. And it's about keeping your caregiver close to you. So babies laugh and coo at their mother or cling, and it's about keeping that caregiver close, and by doing that, it triggers an affectionate response from the adults. So that's a theory of attachment and about how children can actually biologically or evolutionarily want that caregiver close to them, and that's how they do it. Mary Ainsworth was a psychologist who looked at attachment, and she had a experiment that she did called the strange situation, and basically she was looking at the attachment of a child to a mother. So she put the child and the mom in a room with a two-way mirror and put a stranger into the room, and then had the mother leave, and then a little bit later had the mother come back. And so what she did was she looked at the response of the child while the mother was in the room, and the response to the mother and the child and the stranger. She looked at the response when the mother left, and she looked at the response when the mother came back. So she was trying to assess different attachment styles. So there are different attachment styles, and she identified, there were 3 identified and 1 came in later. So a child who's very secure in their attachment. When they're in the playroom, the child is very happy and plays nicely. When the mom leaves, the child pauses and is not happy. And when the mom comes back, welcomes the mom, but carries on and returns to her play. So very secure in their attachment. If you've got someone who they identified with an insecure attachment, is that the child plays quite happily. When the mom leaves, she actually carries on playing. And when the mom comes back, ignores the mom. It's an insecure attachment. And then there was an attachment called an insecure or resistant or ambivalent attachment. So the child is resistant, it clings and very preoccupied with the mother. When the mother leaves, very unhappy and may stop playing. And when the mother comes back, is angry and cries, hits, or clings at the mother. So it's an ambivalent attachment, very wary of strangers, very distressed when the parents leave. And even when the parents come back, they can't be comforted. And then you have a disorganized attachment, which is a very cautious child. When the mom leaves, looks very confused or scared. And when the mother comes back, the child acts very strangely and screams and hits themselves and throws things. So Mary Ainsworth, through this process, identified these 4 different styles of attachment. Most children sit in that secure attachment phase or style, and then the lowest is the disorganized, where 5 to 10% of the children are disorganized. So obviously the maternal behavior, how the mom interacts with the child right from birth, has an influence on that type of attachment. So if you have a mother, for example, who gives birth to a child and maybe she suffers from postnatal stress, maybe the situations in her life that she doesn't bond with the child properly, can have an impact on the attachment. The temperament of the child also has an impact. So if you've got a child who's born who's incredibly difficult or fussy and not easy, it's hard for the mother to generate a relationship with that child or attachment. So those things can actually impact on attachment, and attachment goes right the way through life. So whatever is sort of set in those first few years has an impact on later development. So if there's different sort of parenting approaches. If you're a responsive parent or a sensitive parent, you teach the world that the child that the world is a predictable place and that children can explore, they can always come back, they'll be loved and they'll be secure, and it promotes secure attachments. But you often get parents who are not very responsive, who are insensitive, and those children become they're quite scared and shy and timid. They don't venture far and they demand attention. So the parenting style of parents from birth has an impact on attachment, and obviously that goes on to later in life, future relationships. So very much the type of relationship you had with your mother, if it was secure, has an impact on the kind of relationships you form as an adult. So again, cultural variations come into play, but generally secure attachment is the predominant type of attachment that happens. And I think working with development psychology, and if you haven't had children or are planning to have children, it's really useful information to know for learning how to be an effective caregiver to your child. So those attachment styles, just understand the 4 different attachment styles, and especially the role of the mother or the caregiver in developing attachment with children. Okay, so that is their emotional development. And this is just from your textbook, and it really just is a little diagram that says about how attachment can be developed in children. So it's just, I popped it in there just so you have a look at it in your book, and it just gives you a nice way to understand it. Language, again, with children learning to communicate. And regardless of the environment, language development occurs roughly at the same, supposed to say pace or place, but it happens sort of systematically across child development, is this development of language. And therefore it's very much about biological maturation. So right from 3 months old, the child can coo and gurgle, and about 6 months they start to babble, and about 12 months they produce their first words. And then they learn how to use words, and then they learn how to combine words. And it's important that from an environmental perspective, you talk to your child, you teach children vocabulary, but as much as you're teaching vocabulary, there is an innate ability in children to learn to communicate. And one of the theorists who worked around communication is Chomsky. And it's not in your book, but it's interesting. But his theory says that all language contains similar structures and rules. It's universal. And the fact children everywhere acquire language in the same way and without much effort seems to indicate that we're born wired with the basics already present in our brains. So he spoke about a language acquisition device. So language is very much built into our biology, our ability to speak and to learn to communicate. So that is how communication happens. But the role of caregivers in that situation can enhance the process with vocabulary. But naturally, children have the ability to learn how to communicate. Yeah, I love this because I'm also involved in education with children, and I find it very relevant, Dominica. Yeah. So personality and cognitive development. So during childhood, our personalities develop as well as how we think. Critical stages and critical theorists come into this stage of development. So Erik Erikson, who's sitting over there on the left in the 1960s. So you can see the psychology is quite recent. And this is really how this area of psychology grew, is in this time period from sort of the 1960s until now, and is still growing. He looked at personality, and we'll see that his theory of personality starts with childhood, but it progresses right the way through our lifespan. So in this section, we'll just focus on those stages of his theory that impact in this childhood phase. And he was a stage theorist, so we spoke about stages where it progresses. So the individual must progress through specified stages in a particular order, because each stage builds upon the previous one. Okay, and it's linked to age, and the stages are marked by major discontinuity. So we finish one stage, it discontinues, and we move on to the next stage. So he had 8 stages in his stage theory of personality. And he had these stages. If you look to the left, and I've got the stages on the next slide. So this is just sort of the circular format in infancy. The first stage is trust versus mistrust. And so it's a psychosocial crisis in that stage, with 2 sort of antagonistic tendencies. One is trust, one is mistrust. And how the child resolves those antagonistic tendencies will give the outcome of that stage. So during trust versus mistrust, however that is resolved, the child will come out of it with either trust or come out of it with mistrust. In the next stage, it's about the child developing either autonomy or shame and doubt. And it carries on like that throughout the life cycle. So at preschool age, it's about resolving initiative versus guilt. So let's just pop on to the next stage. And however these are resolved, impact throughout the person's remaining lifespan. So here is Erikson's sort of stage theory. And in your textbook, you'll note that the case study, they integrate it nicely into each of these stages. So have a look at this in your textbook and see how they've applied the case study. So in infancy, 0 to 18 months, the basic conflict in a child's life is around trust versus mistrust. And the key question is my world safe? So children either develop a sense of trust when caregivers provide reliability, care, and affection. If the caregiver can't provide that, basic needs being satisfied in a child, it can lead to mistrust. So the outcome in that stage is either a child who develops trust or mistrust. In early childhood, from 2 to 3, the child struggles between autonomy, is about doing things by themselves, or whether it's shame and doubt. So the important events in that stage are toilet training. So can I do things by myself, or do I always need to rely on others? Can we develop a sense of autonomy, or are we led to experiencing shame and doubt in our own abilities? So children need to develop a sense of personal control over physical skills and a sense of independence. Success leads to feeling of autonomy. Failure leads to feelings of shame and doubt. And those, again, are carried through into the remainder of our life cycle. Preschool, again, still in this phase, is initiative or guilt. Very important for children to explore and play in this stage of their lives. And the key question is, am I good or am I bad? So children need to begin asserting control and power over the environment. Success in this state leads to a sense of purpose. Children who try to exert too much power will experience disapproval, resulting in a sense of guilt. And again, the next stage is industry and inferiority. So how can I be good? So children are put into new situations, coping with new demands. So success, being successful in that new phase of their life, leads to a feeling of competence, and failure results in feelings of inferiority. And the beginnings of the school-going age are very important as to child's success in future school. That if you, in young children when they're just starting school, if you don't show them that they're competent, praise and reward them, they could result in feelings of inferiority. So that's how Erikson's stage theory of personality evolves over early childhood. And we'll touch on it again in the later sections on adolescence and being a young adult. But it's a very interesting theory and a very important theory to be aware of because of its impact on later personality development. And again, still remaining in our early infancy days is cognition, thinking. How do children develop thinking and reasoning and remembering and problem solving? That's all an important part of child development and a critical part that takes place from the minute they're born. So it's all mental activities. And it's very much a function of age. And we know that with children, they move from simpler tasks to more complex tasks. So the important theorists that sit in this phase or around cognitive is Piaget. I don't know if you've heard of Piaget, but he's an important theorist when it comes to children, how they develop that skill of thinking and remembering and problem solving. So his is very much a biological theory, and that children don't start out as cognitive beings. So it's very much about the knowledge of the world being constructed through their own activity and their own discoveries. And again, he's a stage theorist. So children develop through stages. So the first stage is a sensory motor stage, which we'll explain shortly. Then there's a pre-operational stage, a concrete operational stage, and a formal operational stage. So cognition matures as a child starts to use concepts and organizing things in their world, so their cognition starts to develop, their thinking skills, their ability to work with problems and problem solving. So it's a stage theory of cognitive development, was Piaget. Okay, that's just talking about schema, and it's about how children can fit things, new things into the way their current schemas or the way they think about things, or whether they have to make adjustments. It's concepts of assimilation and accommodation, and there's just examples on the page, and I just put that, it's there in your slides, which you can just have a look at and see. So Piaget's stages of cognitive development, there they are. I've put them up for you: the sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational, the age ranges through which the stages occur, and what sort of happens. So right at the beginning in your sensory motor stage, a little new infant is about curiosity with the world. They begin to start to interact with the environment. Put up a mobile, they'll reach and grab for the mobile, and they're starting to put their hands out, feel things, and that's sort of the sensory motor stage, and that's where they develop object permanence. So if you have an object and it's sitting there and you put a cushion over it, the child begins to understand that the object is permanent, it's just been covered rather than it's disappeared completely. So we develop these various ways of dealing with the world around us. So one of his key concepts sits around in the pre-operational stage. He talks about conservation. So conservation is if you've got like a liquid in a container, I measure out 500 mils and it's in a container of one shape, and I pour it into like a long, narrow container, the child immediately thinks there's more water in the second container than in the first container. It's about not being able to understand that the volume is still the same regardless of the shape of the container it's in. So that's what he talks about, conservation. And again, once the child gets to concrete operational stage, that's where they can start to understand these concepts and situations. And the final stage is the formal operational, where they actually start to be able to apply abstract logic and reasoning. It's sort of where cognition really starts to come to the fore. So his key things are around that the children are knowledge seekers, and they actively, by exploring the world around them, contribute to their own development. And it's very much relevant to education as it stands. But again, he has a lot of criticism for his theories. He's very much that all children everywhere go through these stages, and he doesn't really look too much at the individual differences, which can be quite variable. And in a lot of cases, he either underestimated or overestimated the capabilities of the child. And we've also seen that it's not quite a stage like as he implied. It is more gradual and continuous. And he also didn't acknowledge cultural variations with his theory. But that is Piaget's stages of cognitive development, and you need to sort of know what those stages are and to understand what actually happens at each stage. So linked to that comes along Vygotsky, and he's probably more relevant because he starts to speak now about the environment. So with Piaget, the child was at the center, the child was the agent of change, whereas now Vygotsky says, well, actually, it's more important to look at the social interactions, the relationships with parents, teachers, and even older children, especially those who are more skilled. And he calls more knowledgeable others. So this is where the influence is very important, the influence of culture and upbringing. So this is about how through engagement with more knowledgeable others, children learn. So something is out of reach, the child can't do it, but there's a time when through the engagement of somebody else, through showing a child, explaining to a child, scaffolding an activity to a more complex activity, they can actually get to a point where they can do it themselves. But the role of that other person in their lives is critical. So there's a comparison between Piaget and Vygotsky, where Piaget, as we said, had no sort of place in his theory for social cultural context, whereas Vygotsky has a very strong emphasis on the relationship of our environment, especially people in our environment. So therefore, knowledge is constructed socially, whereas Piaget was very much around the individual, that the child themselves develop their own knowledge. And he also, Vygotsky doesn't look at stages. His development is basically continual. Throughout promoting the scaffolding, this learning, the role of language is obviously very important in communication between the more knowledgeable other and the child. And it's about establishing opportunities for children to learn with a teacher. So if you are involved in education, like you said, Dominica, this is sort of a crucial part of education. It's the role of the teacher and the role of shaping the child's learning through your engagement with the child. So a socio-cultural theory, very different to Piaget's and very relevant. And then Kohlberg is very interesting. Kohlberg came along and he looks at the development of moral reasoning. So he has a stage theory. So like Piaget, his theory was in stages, that people work through these different stages. And he presented children or even adults with a moral dilemma. And what he did then was he looked at their responses to that moral dilemma to really look at where they are in their moral development. And children through to adulthood progress through these different stages. There's 3 basic stages of moral development. Your first stage is your pre-conventional level, then you have a conventional and a post-conventional level. And each stage is divided into 2 sort of sub-stages. And I've put a link at the bottom of the slide to quite a nice website that has a nice outline of this particular issue around moral development. So he presented a moral dilemma where a man's wife is very sick, and there's one pharmacist who sells a medication, and the medication is ridiculously overpriced. And so eventually the pharmacist won't help him, he won't reduce the price. So the man breaks into the shop and he steals the medicine. So he basically asks his subjects, how do they feel about that particular situation? And depending on what phase of moral development they're in, that is how their answer is orientated. So younger children really start in that punishment orientation, where things are rewarded by what is punished. You punish something if someone does something bad, you reward if someone does something good. So the younger children start in that pre-conventional level between punishment and reward. Okay. Then as the child sort of gets older, they reach more conventional reasoning, which is very much around society and the order that is imposed on people's moral reasoning by society. So right and wrong is determined by the approval of others around us. And then moving on to right and wrong is determined by society's laws, which need to be adhered to. And then the final stage of the post-conventional level is what we start to reach as adolescents and adults. And there's a social contract orientation where society puts down rules which are viewed, they're right or wrong, but at the same time, because of who you are, there can be experiences that you're involved with where you actually have to say, well, it doesn't really matter how society says, but I need to deal with this because of my own moral conviction, and I deal with it in a certain way. And then the final pinnacle is at that post-conventional level is individual principles and conscious orientation. And I think one of the examples we had in the last year was a question where it asks you to outline the different stages of Kohlberg's moral development and put yourself, where are you now on this stage of moral development, and give an example. And I think it's very important to point out at this stage that what is said in the literature, and very true, is very few people achieve that final stage of moral development. If you do, it puts you sort of up there in line with Nelson Mandela or Mahatma Gandhi, where regardless of what is happening, you deal with things according to your own principles, values, and beliefs, regardless of any other conviction that you might have. So when you do look at yourself, just remember, I had a lot of students who put themselves up there in stage 6, but their answers are not convincing enough to say that you've reached that highest pinnacle of moral development. Stage 5 is where society has got rules, but there are certain cases where the rules do need to be bent, and that happens consistently, not just a once-off occasion. So when you look at that, think about where you are in that and be able to sort of justify where you are. But there's some interesting reading on it, and I've put it there for you. And I don't want to run out of too much time. So adolescence, and we've left childhood now, adolescence, and this is really from your textbook. So it's 10 to 19 years of age, and it's basically puberty until at some point 19, 20, 21. And that is where Robin, they haven't been confirmed yet. I have sent an email, and I'll let you all know as soon as I get that assignment. I saw it was not the right assignment up, so as soon as we get the assignments, I will send them out to you, and I'll let you know. I have sent an email to ask, so hopefully this week I can give you a copy of the assignment. So during that time, obviously our sexual maturity develops, our brain continues to develop, but this is where you start to become individuals. You start to understand who you are. You go through a process of seeking to define who you are. You strive to become free and become masters of your own destiny. So you're striving for individuation and autonomy. And obviously your interpersonal relations are very important. So when we go back to Erikson, and we had that cycle of his personality, at this stage, Erikson looks at identity and role confusion. And we can see that in adolescence. They go through periods that are called identity crises, or confused about what their roles are in life. And so you can see how that personality process is still developing in adolescence. And as adolescents also, we engage in risk-taking behaviors. So in our textbook, there's the different phases, where early adolescence is 12 to 14, middle, and late, and each one has their own sort of biological processes, where we have growth spurts in early adolescence. We start to question things around what was previously our family values. We now start to question them. Middle adolescence, we're starting to try to live more independently. So in each of those stages, you can see there are different physical and cognitive developments that take place, and they're all outlined very straightforwardly in your textbook. But important in adolescence is these components of adolescence that develop. We develop our self-esteem, is how much do we value ourselves, but it's often based on what the people around us think, how we feel we're valued by others. That's how we develop our self-esteem. We develop our morals. So we start to move through Kohlberg's stages, and we start to maybe sometimes question values and beliefs about behavior. And our moral development is very much linked to our family, our peers, and the environment that we're in. We start the socializing processes about being accepted in peer relationships. We start to develop our social thinking. We want to be viewed as competent by our peers, so our self-esteem develops. So socialization in adolescence is important. Our cognition, our thinking, our problem solving all develops. We become more intellectual thinkers. We learn to self-regulate ourselves, and we also learn to reflect. And what becomes an all-powerful belief system. And we have physical development that takes place, sexual maturation, physical development of our bodies and things like that. So in adolescence, those are the key components that have a big link on our psychological well-being. I'm sorry I'm not hanging around here too much, but I'm conscious of time for you all as well. So Erikson's stages, like we said, that age of adolescence, we struggle with identity and role confusion. So we try to get we go for the positive outcome. So the positive outcome is identity, achieving our identity. Role confusion can lead to problems later in life. And obviously, to understand our identity, we have to start asking profound questions, which we do as adolescents. We start to question things. And then you can see moving up the scale how we move through into adulthood, intimacy and isolation, etc. Identity formation is in your textbook, and I'll let you read it. So it's about how we commit and explore and how we achieve identity. When we achieve it, it means that we've made a commitment to our futures, we've explored, we know what we want to do. Whereas somebody who doesn't know or doesn't care is somebody who hasn't really explored what's available to them and doesn't have much commitment to do so. So that is just how identity formation can take place, through exploration of our futures and committing to our futures during adolescence. And adulthood. So again, personality pretty much remains stable throughout our adult life. Certain traits can either increase or decrease, but generally people follow the same trajectory of personality, that it remains relatively stable. Certain traits may either increase or decrease. So for example, as people get older, they're not as extroverted as they were when they were younger. They're not as open to new experiences. Those sort of traits decline with age, whereas some traits increase with age. And in adulthood, we revert back to Erikson again, and his stages is intimacy and isolation. So are we able to develop the capacity in adulthood to share intimacy with others? And a resolution of that leads to somebody who's got empathy and open. The next one is generativity and self-absorption. So concern for the welfare of future generations, or a life at empty without progress. And the final stage is integrity versus despair. So have we had a life well lived and we can sort of grow old with integrity, or do we feel that our life has been empty and meaningless and we're full of despair? And we dwell on past mistakes and we worry about the future. So that's the final reconciliation of his psychosocial stages. Sorry, I feel like I'm going quickly, but please you can ask any questions via email if I've lost any of you. And the final stage is obviously the aging. And as we get to that final stage of aging, we have physiological changes, we lose our hair, body fat increases, muscle tone decreases, some of our motor skills get slower, we lose visual acuity, our hearing can go. All of that can impact on how we feel about ourselves getting old. Changes in hormonal functioning as menopause. So there's aging, natural changes that happen with aging. But at the same time, there's physiological changes. There's also neural changes. So our brain tissue and brain weight declines. So there's that active shrinking of neurons, which is why it's important when you get older to keep your mind stimulated, to do crossword puzzles or read or have meaningful conversations, so that you can slow down that natural aging of neurological processes, right down to the point where, aging and neural changes can lead to disease like dementia, which is cognitive defects like memory impairment, and Alzheimer's disease is responsible for dementia. So it's a neural degeneration of certain neurons that can cause memory loss and cognitive defects, which we see quite prevalently in our society. And again, dealing with the psychosocial aspects, it's about dealing with death and dying. And it's usually linked to getting older. So life expectancy has generally increased, but at the same time, South Africa's got one of the highest adult mortality rates in the world because of the environments in which we live. Disease is a big issue, transmittable and non-transmittable diseases, poverty, poor health, care facilities, murder, car accidents. So a lot of the time, the psychosocial aspects of aging are linked to the impending death death part of our life cycle, but especially in South Africa where that mortality rate is a lot higher. So I made it just on an hour, guys. I'm sorry I rushed through the last few slides, but I think you've got a good understanding of this chapter. If anybody's got any questions, you're welcome to ask me. You can ask me now in the chat, or otherwise you can send me an email and I will respond. The assignment, as I said, as soon as I get access to it, it's due on the 14th of September. I have put all your dates for your collabs and everything on your calendar. We've got plenty of time this semester to cover everything. The first assignment is on the 14th of September, so we still have time, plenty of time, but I will give it to you as soon as I've got it. The WhatsApp groups, I don't have a WhatsApp group, but if anybody on this chat has got a WhatsApp group and they'd like to put their number up, I can take the number down and share it. I respond via email pretty much within 24 hours. Over weekends, maybe slightly longer. You can also message me off VC Learn. But I don't get involved in WhatsApp groups because I communicate via announcements. So if somebody wants to take that down, that's someone who wants to be in a WhatsApp group. If anybody has a WhatsApp group, thanks, Shirley. I'm just going to write that number down because I've got students who are messaging me to ask me. Oops, pencil's broken. There we go, guys. So if you want to share that number out, if Shirley's happy to do that. And yeah, so please, I don't get involved in the WhatsApp groups. I do communicate via announcements and responsive to my emails and messages. So any questions, you can just ask me that way. Any questions? Are we good? Are you happy to now go enjoy a public holiday tomorrow, and a happy Women's Day to all of us women? You are what hold up the world. Okay, you good? Thanks, Almas. Thank you. I'm glad you're going to watch it again. I'll put up the recording tomorrow for you. The slides are up on one group. I'll pop them up on another group. But I think we've covered everything. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.